All right. We'll go ahead and get started today. I just wanted to take an opportunity to welcome University of Alaska Anchorage. They've been a customer of ours since October 2017. So they do have a lot of time with us, which has been awesome, and one of our legacy clients that continues to look for new opportunities to make Salesforce and Enrollment Rx better. Today, Pat Bajorn is going to talk through from rookie to Wookie, automated document transfers. And so I am going to pass that off to him in just 1 second. I wanted to ask, we will be putting up a survey towards the end of the session or a poll. If you could please take that poll, we greatly appreciate your feedback. It means a ton to us. And so without further ado, I'll go ahead and let Pat, who is the CRM administrator. He's been at UAA for 18 years and in this role for about 18 months. And so welcome, Pat.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so this project that I want to talk about today, it started out of a need to increase the visibility into some of our data and just to increase the transparency into some of the data. So I familiarized myself with the Salesforce RESTful API and proved to myself that I could download documents on a schedule, automated, and manipulate them a little bit. And then I made this little proof of concept. I presented it to some of the directors, and they gave me the approval to flesh out the details and build it out. And so I did that about 5 years ago, and that started with Transcripts. And so I built onto it a little bit over the years, but mostly it's been running without incident for 5 years. So the thing that I want to go through today is talk with you about what it does, and then look at it from the perspective of the customers. And then we can look at how it does what it does from a functional level. And then I wrote all of the source code so we can get into the details of looking at how it actually does what it does from a programmer's perspective. And then we can look at the security that supports the system. And then we'll have time at the end for Q&A. But before we get started, I want to mention that in my experience, these sessions, they always provide the most value if you interrupt me with either a question or a comment in real time. And so if this becomes more of a discussion instead of just me talking and you listening. So feel free to raise your hand at any time if you have a question or a comment. And odds are that if you do, then there are at least a couple other people that are wondering something similar. So, or feel free to hold until the end if you prefer. So just a quick question. If you can, use the Zoom hand raise, and just raise your hand if you work in the IT side of the house. And this is just so I can get a better idea of who I'm speaking to today. And so I can address you appropriately if you're more on the administrative side, staff, or not staff, but on the IT side of the house or not. That would be great.
About 25%
okay.
Have raised their hands.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so what this thing does is this little process comes to life each morning before the employees come into the office. And it evaluates it looks for the documents that were uploaded in the last 24 hours. So that might be high school transcripts, but when people log into the application portal, they might also upload letters of recommendation, statement of goals, resumes, or whatnot. So the first thing it does is it does two things basically. It looks to see what has been uploaded in the last 24 hours. And then in the case of transcripts, it looks to see which transcripts have been marked transfer to OnBase. And OnBase is our document imaging system. And what this does is it'll go and it'll evaluate each of those transcripts. And if they meet a certain criteria, then it will actually download the PDF or the .docx or whatever file type it was. and it'll prepare that for OnBase. So it'll rename the file accordingly, and then it will upload them to a server in Fairbanks, Alaska, which is where our OnBase system sits. And then later, separately, the OnBase system looks in that folder each day, Monday through Friday, and it imports the files that it finds in there. So a couple things. I say transcripts, but today, for this purposes of this discussion, I'll be saying education histories and transcripts, meaning the same thing. So I apologize. I should stick to one or the other, but it's a bad habit. And then, so the process, like I said, it does the last 24 hours and then it does transcripts, but it also does letters of recommendation. And then I'm in the process of adding other doc types like resume, statement of goals, etc. But no matter what the doc type is, it first does one and then does the next, then does the next. And those are all, that process is 99.9% the same, regardless of document type. So I'm going to stick with transcripts for today. That was the original doc type, but pretty much all of it applies whether you're doing letters of rec or any other document types. So from the customer perspective, from the student perspective, they don't know anything about this. What they know is that they started an application in the portal, and at some point, maybe they uploaded a high school transcript or some of these other documents, and that's it. The other customer is our other staff members, and they also don't know anything about this, but what they know is that when they want to see any of these documents, they go to OnBase, which is our document imaging system. And that's it. They just magically, at least as far as they're concerned, these documents just magically appear there. So, so how it works from a functional level, if we just look at number one first, so get the metadata for each file that was uploaded in the last 24 hours, and for transcripts that have been tagged transfer to OnBase equals yes. So this is a custom field that I added onto the transcript and any document type that we're doing. So in the last 24 hours, it gets a list of all the files that are uploaded in the last 24 hours. If we say, for example, 3 of them are transcripts, then it pulls out those 3. And then we also do a query, find all the transcripts where transfer to OnBase equals true or equals yes. In this example, we find 3. So what we've got are 6 transcripts, and we want to evaluate them to see if they meet a certain criteria. So that's what we'll do for this first run. And then number 2, we evaluate to see. And what the criteria is real simple. The application must be at least submitted. The transcript type must be high school. We're a banner school, so the student has to have a valid banner ID. But generically speaking, the student must have a valid student ID. And then the campus applying is one thing in Salesforce, but it's a different thing in OnBase. So we just translate it. So of those 6, we'll say maybe half of them meet this criteria. So now we're going to download those 3 files one at a time. And then, so after we download the file, the first thing we do is rename it. And so we rename it to this format. And this was given to me by the OnBase administrators. And then the very next thing we do is for that document that we just downloaded, this would all be on one line. We create this new entry in an index file. So we download the file, we rename it, and then we put one line in this index file. So then when we're done, we have the 3 files that we downloaded and 1 index file. So we have 4 files total. And that's what gets uploaded to Fairbanks to a network share that the OnBase system can import from. So I guess I jumped ahead of myself. So after we download the file, we rename it, we put an entry in the index file, and then we poke back into Salesforce. So we make another API call and we change transfer to OnBase to complete. That's sort of the gist of what this does each day. And we'll get into the technical details in just a minute. But I want to mention, so I work for the University of Alaska Anchorage, and all 3 universities in the University of Alaska system, we're 3 separately accredited universities, but we share a single banner instance, which, as on the side note, we just migrated to Amazon's cloud via Ellucian Cloud. So if anybody's interested in that, you can send me an email separately. And if you want any real world feedback, if you're looking into that yourself. So we share a banner instance. We share, all three universities share a Salesforce org, and we share a OnBase, single OnBase implementation. So when I design systems like this, they actually just also work for the other two universities. And in fact, it would take me extra work to make it only work for mine. Excuse me. And I mention that because I know that some other universities do shared systems and some don't, but this is just an easy way to automatically provide value or provide extra value for the other universities in your system, which helps build bridges over the years and years of doing this stuff. So again, started with transcripts. At some point I added letters of rec, and now I have a laundry list of doc types that I'll be adding over this coming year. And it's been running without incident for 5 years. So on a technical level, these are RESTful API calls. Some are SOQL queries, and some just call the native endpoints. So an endpoint would be like the transcript, which would be education _history _C, because that's the name of the object. Everything that I'm mentioning today runs on a Linux box in my data center, except for this one thing. Number two, we have automation, which nowadays are flows on the application, so that when it becomes submitted, so when they go from started to submitted, if any documents have already been uploaded, it will set transfer to OnBase true for those documents that have already been uploaded. And I say true, but here it says yes. To me, that's the same thing, but I apologize. I should be consistent. This is an example. This is an entire file right here. This is a JSON format file where we specify one field and then the value that we want it to be. And if you're familiar with other RESTful APIs, you might be familiar with get, put, post, and delete. And that's how we get data out. Put is to modify data. Post is to create a new record. And then there's also head. But there also is a method called patch. And so when you patch a file, you send, or when you patch a transcript, you send this JSON file to the transcript endpoint, to the education history endpoint, and you specify the Salesforce ID of a single transcript. So you're referencing one single transcript, and you're saying on that transcript, do whatever is in this JSON file, patch this in. And for us, for this process, that's just one field, and set it to yes. And then as eventually it came where somebody needed to manually set this for some reason, one of those edge cases. So this is just also a field that's exposed on the transcript and the letter of recommendation. So they can just flip it to yes. And then the next morning when the process runs, that will get transferred over. So this is the actual, I pulled this out of the source code. This is a SOQL query for the last 24 hours. The first variable early, URLY, this would be like your university.my.salesforce.com. And then this is the path to the query endpoint. I need 5 years ago, the latest version was 37. I think they're up to 56 or 57 now. I need to update this. But so we select the 4 columns from the attachment object, and then where created date is since the last time it ran, which typically is the previous day, except during outages or whatnot, up until 3 a.m. With time zone offset for Alaska were either 8 or 9 hours, depending on daylight savings time. Oops. So this is the result of that query. This is a real result set. So in this case, this is what I got back was 81 records. I think it can fit 200 in a single. So if you get more than 200, this done will be false, and they'll give you a URL to get the next 200. If I remember right, we've never gone over 200, but these are those 4 columns. So this is the actual PDF or whatever the file format it is. So ID is the ID of that document. parent ID is whatever it's attached to. So a transcript, a letter of recommendation, whatever. And then you always get back this attributes array with type and URL. And then this is it. So I did all of the development using this tool called REST Explorer, which I think you should all have access to. And a lot of the documentation and the trails and everything that I see, people always mention going up to, so if you're logged into Salesforce, you go to your username and click it. And then I think the third option down is developer console. But I actually find this tool to be a lot more intuitive, and maybe it's just because of my background, but I can't recommend REST Explorer enough for doing this type of development and experimentation and just research in general. So I highly recommend checking this out. This is an example from REST Explorer getting a result for a specific attachment. And right here, parent ID, since this is A-OK or A0K, the first three characters tell you what type of object is, so I can tell that this is a transcript. We cannot rely on this value because this is provided by a human, right? This is what the person named their transcript, in this case, on their computer before they had uploaded it to Salesforce. So this is a SQL query for the transcripts. So this is interesting. It's the same endpoint, the query, but there's two selects. If we ignore the second one for just a second, what we're saying is select name from ed history or transfer OnBase equals true or equals yes. So what we're getting is the name of each transcript that we want to consider to download. And then for each transcript that it finds, it does the subselect. So it gets those same four columns from the attachment object. So we get the transcript where transfer OnBase equals true, and then we get the ID of the associated attachment, and we get the parent ID of that attachment. Now, by definition, parent ID is the ID of this transcript because the transcript is the senior and the attachments are the junior or the sub relationship. So instead of doing SQL query, when we get the metadata for each of these things, we go to an endpoint, so directly to the education history in this example. So parent object is this, so /s object /ed history, and then this is the Salesforce ID, that long 15 character or 18 character unique identifier for any particular transcript in your organization. And then this is how we make a call where we poke back into Salesforce to specify that we have transferred it. So again, we go to that same endpoint, ed history, and we specify a particular Salesforce ID of a particular transcript. But instead of getting the metadata for this, we're actually, instead of get, we're specifying patch. And then with the patch method, you have to say ampersand and then the JSON file. And this is wrong. I just noticed this morning. This should be, if we're poking back in and we're saying that we have transferred this should say set transfer to OnBase to complete.json. So I apologize for that. And then this is how we actually download the PDF or what type it is. Again, we go to the attachment endpoint and then the 15 or 18 character, this is the Salesforce ID, and then /body. It's interesting. It's like a method call to actually download the actual file, the PDF or whatnot. So on this first one, get the metadata. This, again, using that REST Explorer is an example of it. So A0K, I can tell this is, without going any further, I can tell this is the metadata for a transcript. And in our org, our transcripts have 165 fields. So this is just a short snippet of some of them. This is the associated application. And again, because this is A0B, I can tell that this Salesforce ID is for an application. So this is just an example of some of the data that you get back when we talk about getting the metadata for a transcript, because we have to evaluate it. One of them would be the So for the associated application, one of them is going to be right here, the admission status at the bottom. I guess it's kind of cut off, but it has to be at least submitted. And then one of these is also going to be the student ID, so the banner ID. And then one of them is going to be the type, where it has to be at least high school. Which while preparing for this session, I think that somewhere it's going to say that the type name, I think, is high school. But I think that I could have also evaluated this string because I think this correlates to a high school transcript. Yeah, so we're at 20 minutes. That sort of, I've got a couple other things to talk about, but that's the gist that I wanted to show and discuss about this project, is that it makes these SOQL queries. It finds out what documents have been uploaded in the last 24 hours. And then it also queries for transcripts where transferred OnBase is true. And then it merges those two into a list of just the transcripts. And then it for each of them, it gets the metadata, which is this, and it looks to see, do they meet those couple of criteria? The admission status, the application status has to be at least submitted. They have a valid banner ID, etc. High school type, or the type is high school. And then if it meets that, then we actually do this where we download it. And then we do the renaming, which I didn't show. That's not part of the Salesforce or the API end of things. And then it copies these PDFs or JPEGs or whatever they are, and that one index file to a server in Fairbanks so that the OnBase system can import it. I guess I should mention that, so for us, OnBase is our document imaging system. But generically speaking, what this system does is it automatically gets documents out of Salesforce and it puts them somewhere. And that really is the end of it. So even if you don't use the document imaging system, if you just have that need, this system would satisfy that. Because the fact that OnBase looks in a directory, reads the index file, and then imports the PDFs is sort of separate from what I'm talking about today. So the next step is to talk about the security of the system. But I guess before we get into that, let me pause for just a minute and ask if anybody has any comments or questions about anything that I've said so far. And if we don't, then I'll just go ahead and we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so each morning the system comes to life and it logs in to Salesforce to make these SOQL queries and to look at these endpoints for transcripts. But before it can do that, the first thing you have to do is, as an admin, you have to go to Salesforce with your web browser, log in, and you have to create what's called a connected app. And when you do that, it's very basic. There's only a couple things that you enter, the name that you want to call your app and a couple of things. But when you hit save, Salesforce generates for you these two long tokens. It's called a consumer key and a consumer secret. So each morning, and then you need to put those into your app. So each morning when this system comes to life, the first thing that it does is it logs in. And so to log in, it sends a username and a password and the consumer key and the consumer secret. And then after a successful login, what it gets back is called an access token. And so you need to, the program, your code has to save that. And then every time it makes an API call to make a SOQL query or to query a particular transcript or anything else, instead of sending the username and password again, it sends this access token. So that's obviously valuable. So you have to protect that in your program. And what you can do is the user that's going to log in, you can create a user in Salesforce, give them the minimal permissions. This is all read-only access, except for that one field, transfer to OnBase. It has to be able to update that to complete or to yes. And then and then you create a Salesforce profile, a user profile, and you put that user in the profile. And at the profile, you can specify that that this user can only log in from certain IP addresses, and this is all scheduled, so you know when it's going to run. So you can say when that person or that that account can log in. So that's the premise of locking down the access for this application and for this system. Create a connected app, give the user, give them minimal permissions to only the objects that you're going to be using. So I'm doing transcripts and right now letters of rec. And then you specify when they can log in and from where they can log in. And let's see. So and so that's pretty much it for the security side of the house. There's one question in the Q&A. It says, regarding the QA development, did you use tools like Jitterbit? So no, I did not. I used the REST Explorer, which is at the bottom of this slide, workbench.developerforce.com/REST Explorer. So if you just go to workbench.developerforce.com, you'll get a username and password prompt and you log in with your Salesforce ID. And then there are several tools that you can choose from. But for me, I just go straight to this URL because I always use REST Explorer. But that allows me to see every single field. It's like if you're in the SQL world, where you can do describe. You can do a /describe on any of these endpoints, and it will show you all of the metadata for that object. So for an education history /describe, it will tell you all of the fields. And then instead of /describe, you can put in / and then the Salesforce ID for any particular of that object. So the Salesforce ID of any particular transcript. So that would be /education_history_C/ and then the 15 or 18 character Salesforce ID. And that will give you those, for me, it's 165 fields of data, of the real data for that one particular transcript. So I have a couple other.
Few more questions for you, Pat.
Did you say you have other ones?
Yes, I have. Yeah, I just wanted to have you explain how this project has really benefited UA as a whole.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, it has not only benefited UAA, but the other universities. So that's an easy win in that relationship building. And this has, first of all, made it more, made the adoption of Enrollment Rx and Salesforce more widespread across the university, and just provided more access to more people at the university. So that was a big win. And so to the customers, we got to always keep the customer perspective in mind. That means that they get served quicker. So that's the bottom line, is better customer service is sort of the end run for building and implementing this. And like I said, it might seem weird to give this benefit or this value to your quote unquote competing universities, but in some ways they're competitors and in some ways they're not. I mean, we're all in this for education. So so that was a neat experience to be able to provide this. And then also they in turn provide better customer experience for their users as well, for their students and potential students.
Thank you, Paul. And when you think about this, what would have been your option if this wasn't developed on the platform?
Where we were was just that the time to get this info or get these responses to the people who can help the students was longer. So it was slower, it was worse customer service. And I have a couple other things that I wanted to mention too about the development of this, but I can hold those until we get through any other questions that came in from the audience or from yourself. I'm not sure where these are coming from.
Yep. And that is all the questions I have right now.
Okay, so I wanted to mention a couple of things. So this all runs in Linux. So I run this. These are all just bash scripts, so shell scripts. But bash isn't super popular. So your programmers have probably heard of things like Python is really popular, Rust and Java or C or whatever. This could be implemented anywhere that you guys are comfortable with. But my tool of choice has always just been at the command prompt if I can, and then go up from there if I need to. So since this all runs on my Linux box, so all the development is done in staging, of course. And then what I have, so when it logs in, it has some variables, like the URL is different from staging to prod, and the username and password is different from staging to prod. So there are a few variables, and they just live in a file called prod variables and staging variables. So to migrate this from staging to prod, all I had to do was point my script or to reference the prod version of those. So there's no migrating anything on the Salesforce side. I just change where my script, where they look at. So it was real simple. The one caveat or the exception to that is that I did have to put that flow, I did have to install that in prod on the transcript object. I'm sorry, on the application, so that when the application becomes submitted. So attachments versus files, some of you might be, this was just brought to my attention last week. Some of you might have questioned attachments instead of Salesforce files. I have heard of files. We haven't moved to them yet, but after I became aware of that last week, I did a little bit of research. And I think that instead of going to the attachments endpoint, I think that files are implemented in 3 endpoints because they're a lot more powerful. They're a lot more flexible, it looks like. But I think the one that would replace it is called content document. But there seems to be a popular one called content document. I think content document, maybe URL and content document version. So I haven't fleshed out the details. I will have to before we migrate our ERX or Salesforce to files instead of these attachments. So that would be something to consider if you're already using Salesforce files and no longer using Salesforce attachments. So something that I might consider I might do differently if I rebuilt this today, because now 5 years later, I've learned a lot more about Salesforce, is this is all done serially, so one at a time, because that's the programming that I am used to. But as the world has continued to move forward, parallel processing has become a lot more important. And in Salesforce, it is definitely important because you do not want to hit your API limits of your org. So I would, like right now, like Friday, for example, this process ran and it transferred 13 documents. So that's not a big deal, but in a heavy time, it can be up to, I think I've seen as high as about 80 documents in a single day. So there's a lot of API calls going on, or not a lot, but there's API calls going back and forth. And so I would consider the complexity of programming for parallelism or batch processing, or I can queue these things up and then in a single call, in a single API call, send the instructions, and it would do all of them at once in parallel. And I think Salesforce refers to that as bulkification or bulkifying your API calls. we're nowhere near that limit yet. In fact, our API calls, we run around 7 to 8% in our 24-hour limit. So we're not even getting close to it yet. But still, it's it's the quote unquote right way to approach programming. And if you're going to start something from the beginning, you might as well do it the right way with parallel processing. Something just came in that says we use a weekly data export to grab all of our files and import them into our in-house systems. That's cool. Do you prefer the API method instead of? Well, so that's exactly it for timeliness. I run this once a day. I could run this every hour. I could run it every 5 minutes. I try to run, I don't. I try. So really, that's not my decision. I put forth my recommendation, but really, the directors and other people, we all sit to discuss things like this. The reason I do it once a day and the reason I do it outside of business hours is because I don't want to put any more weight on our system to slow it down anymore, because it's already not the fastest thing in the world. So, so if I ran it every 5 minutes, it wouldn't find up to 80 documents at a single time, right? Because that's across 24 hours that those get built up or queued up. But it would be like another person working. It literally would be like another person working the documents during business hours when the system is already pretty heavily loaded. So yeah, that's exactly why we do it. Basically, our people, we all got together and discussed this, the reality of performance, and decided that, and really this is the admissions directors and the people in charge of enrollment services, deciding that once a day was enough for our business processes. But yeah, you could do it. You could do it as often as you want. If you have the Salesforce CPU, GPU, the spare processing power to do that. So, but yeah, so that's interesting that you do it weekly. I'm not sure what all things equal, I'm not sure that they would even want it more than once a day because of the, their working queues. And I don't know the reality of if they're ever sitting in dead water waiting for work to come in to do. So let's see. Okay, so that's all of the extra questions that I had brought, and I'm not seeing any other questions. So Misty, if there is nothing else, I will thank you all for coming today. The easiest way to get a hold of me is the easiest address to remember is alaska.edu at alaska.edu. If you are not a technical person and you want your technical people to reach out to me, feel free to shoot me an email. If you want feedback about moving to the Ellucian cloud, I can get that to you also. And the easiest address to remember is alaska.edu at alaska.edu. So thanks for your time, and thank you, Misty, and I'll hand it back.
Thanks, Pat. Can you go ahead and move that to the next screen, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, no problem. So just a little bit from where we've been to where we are. We're in our final week of our summer school sessions. And so we appreciate all that have joined and really took part in a lot of this. But don't forget, tomorrow is the return of flows. And I know it's a popular session, so don't forget about that. And, they'll go through the next step in the journey from Flow Padawan to Flow Jedi. So get ready for that. We also have our raffle winner with the $25 Amazon gift card, and that goes to Laura McGuire with Curry College. And so if you've been a gift card winner, you will be hearing from me and we'll get that sent out to you. But we're very excited for tomorrow's session. And then don't forget, Friday is the wrap up where we're going to do some additional prizes. So don't miss that event either with Audrey and myself. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and I appreciate you taking the time to do the poll. And Pat, thank you so much for presenting and sharing how you are doing things with OnBase.
Awesome. Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you, guys.
All right. Bye-bye.